The hum of the airplane cabin was like white noise, a soft backdrop to the muffled chatter of passengers settling into their seats. A steady stream of people filed down the aisle, tugging carry-ons and scanning seat numbers. Among them was James, a middle-aged man dressed in a crisp suit, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. He carried himself with an air of superiority, the kind that turned heads for all the wrong reasons. He hated flying, not because of the discomfort, but because of the people he'd inevitably have to share space with. As he reached his row, James frowned. His seatmate, a tall black man in casual clothes, was already seated by the window. The man was muscular, his posture upright and commanding, though his expression was calm, almost unbothered. James didn't bother to hide his irritation as he shoved his bag into the overhead compartment. "Great," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the other man to hear. "Just my luck." The man glanced up briefly but said nothing, his deep brown eyes betraying no emotion. James huffed as he sat down, pointedly turning away to look out into the aisle. He prided himself on being direct, someone who spoke his mind, no matter who'd offended. That's what people respected, wasn't it? Brutal honesty. The flight attendant's cheerful voice came over the intercom, announcing the usual pre-flight safety procedures. James barely listened, distracted by his growing annoyance. As the plane began to taxi, he leaned slightly toward the man beside him. "So," James started, his tone clipped, heading somewhere important. The man turned his head, offering a small, polite smile. "Just heading home." James raised an eyebrow, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "Home, huh? Military, I assume? You look like the type." The man nodded once, his smile fading slightly. "That's right. U.S. Army." James snorted, shaking his head. "Figures. Always thought the military was desperate, but I guess I didn't realize how low the standards had gotten." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. A few passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably in their seats, casting glances but choosing to stay silent. The man next to James didn't react immediately, his expression unreadable. After a pause, he simply said, "I see." The calmness in his voice only irritated James further. "You see? That's all you've got to say. Look, I'm just being honest. It's nothing personal. But let's be real. Some of you join the military because it's the only way out of, well, you know." This time, the man's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of headphones, slipping them on as if to end the conversation. James rolled his eyes and turned back to face the front, muttering to himself about respect and entitlement. He couldn't understand why people couldn't just take a joke, or why they acted so sensitive these days. As the plane ascended into the clouds, James noticed a few passengers glaring at him, their disapproval written all over their faces, but he shrugged it off. They didn't understand his point of view. He was entitled to his opinions, wasn't he? Hours passed and the flight landed without further incident. The man beside James gathered his things, nodding politely as he left the plane. James didn't bother to say goodbye. He had already moved on in his mind, barely giving the encounter a second thought. The next morning, James sipped his coffee while scrolling through the news on his phone. A headline caught his eye. "Decorated Black Soldier Saves Dozens in Courageous Act Overseas." Beneath the headline was a photo, a familiar face staring back at him. It was the man from the plane. James felt his stomach drop. James blinked at his phone, his heart skipping a beat. He stared at the headline again, as if rereading it might change what he'd just seen. But there was no mistake. The man in the photo was the same calm, quiet figure who had sat beside him on the plane. The same man James had insulted without a second thought. Now his face was plastered across the news, hailed as a hero. The article detailed a daring rescue overseas. It told of an ambush in a conflict zone where a small squad had been outnumbered and pinned down by enemy fire. The soldier, identified as Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks, had risked his life to save not only his team, but also innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. Against all odds, Elijah had managed to extract everyone safely, sustaining injuries in the process. Doctors were hopeful, but he was still in critical condition. James felt a strange weight settle in his chest. He scrolled through the article, his hand tightening around his coffee cup. There was a video embedded in the piece, showing a press conference where military officials praised Elijah's bravery. One officer described him as a man of unshakable courage and integrity, someone who had put others above himself, even in the face of unimaginable danger. James leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Courage and integrity. The words seemed to echo in his head, contrasting sharply with the dismissive tone he used on the plane. He remembered Elijah's calm demeanor, the quiet way he had endured James' remarks without lashing out. At the time, James had taken it as passivity, a sign of weakness. Now it felt like something else entirely, a kind of strength he couldn't begin to understand. The news didn't stop there. As James scrolled further, he found more stories about Elijah. There were interviews with his colleagues, friends, and even a few civilians he had saved during previous missions. They all spoke of his humility, his unwavering sense of duty, and his kindness. One woman tearfully recounted how Elijah had carried her injured son for miles after an explosion, refusing to rest until the boy was safe. James' coffee had gone cold by the time he set his phone down. He sat in silence, staring out the window at the grey morning sky. For the first time in a long while, he felt something he couldn't quite put into words. Guilt, maybe. Embarrassment. But there was something else too, a nagging sense of inadequacy. He had built his life on the belief that he was better than most people, that his opinions were always justified. Yet here was a man who had every reason to look down on him, who had every right to put him in his place, and he hadn't done it. Instead, Elijah had simply let James' words pass, as if they weren't worth the trouble. James tried to push the thoughts away, but they clung to him throughout the day. At work, he found himself distracted, replaying the scene on the plane over and over in his mind. He remembered the way Elijah had looked out the window, headphones on, seemingly unaffected. But now James wondered, had he been hurt? Had James' words pierced through that quiet composure, leaving wounds that didn't show? That evening, James found himself drawn back to his phone. He searched for more articles about Elijah, reading about his career in the army, the missions he had led, and the countless lives he had touched. There were photos too. Elijah in his uniform, standing tall and proud. Elijah with his family, his arm around his younger sister. Elijah smiling as he handed out supplies to children in a remote village. Each image felt like a window into a life James had never bothered to imagine. As the hours passed, James's feelings of guilt deepened. He thought about the things he'd said, the assumptions he'd made. He thought about how easily he had dismissed Elijah as just another stranger, someone unworthy of respect. And now, knowing what he knew, James couldn't help but wonder, what kind of man did that make him? The next morning, James couldn't shake the thought of Elijah. He felt a growing need to do something, to make amends in some way. But how? He didn't even know if Elijah would remember him, let alone care about an apology. Still, James couldn't ignore the weight in his chest. He decided to start small. James spent the day researching ways to support soldiers and veterans. He found organizations that provided resources for those returning from deployment, as well as charities that helped injured service members recover. He made a few donations, but even that didn't feel like enough. It was a start, but it didn't erase what he had done. It didn't change the fact that he had judged someone without knowing anything about them. By the time James went to bed that night, he had made up his mind. He would find a way to apologize to Elijah directly, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it might be. He didn't know if it would make a difference, but he felt like he owed it to the man, and to himself, to try. The next morning, James woke up early and began his search. He combed through news articles and social media posts, looking for any mention of Elijah's condition. He found updates from the hospital where Elijah was being treated, as well as messages of support from people all over the world. Eventually, James came across a comment thread where someone had posted about a fundraiser for Elijah's medical bills. The event was being organized by a local community center, and it was open to the public. James hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the screen. Could he really show up? What would he even say? But the thought of doing nothing felt worse. Taking a deep breath, he saved the details of the event and made a plan to attend. As the day of the fundraiser approached, James couldn't shake his nerves. He thought about how Elijah might react, how the people there might judge him if they knew the truth. But deep down, he knew this wasn't about him. It was about acknowledging the harm he had caused and making an effort to set things right. When the day finally arrived, James stood outside the community center, his heart pounding. He could hear the buzz of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter from inside. Taking one last deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped inside, unsure of what awaited him. The community center was bustling with activity. Tables lined the walls, covered in photos, posters, and handwritten notes of encouragement for Elijah. A large banner hung near the entrance that read, "Supporting our hero, Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks." The air was filled with the hum of conversation, the occasional clink of coffee mugs, and the sound of children laughing as they chased each other between the tables. James paused just inside the doorway, his heart racing. He felt out of place, like an uninvited guest at a private celebration. People milled around him, chatting and laughing, their faces bright with admiration for the man who had brought them all together. James' eyes scanned the room, searching for some kind of anchor, but instead, he was met with reminders of Elijah everywhere. Photos of him in uniform, smiling with his comrades, and holding the hands of the children he had rescued were displayed with pride. Each image seemed to magnify the weight of James's guilt. As James lingered near the entrance, a woman approached him. She was in her late 50s, with kind eyes and a warm smile that seemed to put him slightly at ease. "Welcome," she said, handing him a small program for the event. "Are you here to support Elijah?" James hesitated, his throat dry. Yes," he said awkwardly. I wanted to help." The woman's smile widened. "That's wonderful. Every bit helps. He's touched so many lives, hasn't he? My husband served with him overseas. He always said Elijah was the kind of man you'd want by your side in the worst situations." James nodded, unsure of what to say. He glanced down at the program in his hand, pretending to study it. The woman gave him a gentle pat on the arm before moving on to greet another guest, leaving James alone with his thoughts once again. He wandered through the room, stopping occasionally to read the notes written to Elijah. Some were from fellow soldiers, others from strangers who had been moved by his story. One note caught James' attention in particular. It was written in a child's uneven handwriting and taped to a drawing of a man in uniform standing in front of a helicopter. It read, "Thank you, Mr. Brooks, for being brave. My daddy says you are a real hero." James felt a lump rise in his throat. The simplicity of the message hit him harder than he expected. He thought back to the plane ride, to the way he had dismissed Elijah without knowing anything about him. Here was a man who had risked everything for others, who had inspired so many people, and James had treated him as if he were nothing. As he continued to walk, James overheard snippets of conversations. People shared stories about Elijah's kindness, his dedication, and the sacrifices he had made. One man recounted a time when Elijah had stayed behind during a mission to ensure everyone else got out safely, even though it meant putting himself in danger. Another woman spoke about how Elijah had organized a food drive for families in need during the holidays, despite his demanding schedule. The more James listened, the more he realized how little he truly understood about people like Elijah. He had spent so much of his life wrapped up in his own world, judging others based on surface-level assumptions. Now he was confronted with the depth and complexity of someone he had wronged, and it left him feeling small. Near the back of the room, a table was set up with a guest book where people could write messages for Elijah. James hesitated as he approached it, his mind racing. What could he possibly say? How could he put into words the regret he felt, the shame that had been eating away at him since he'd read that first news article? He picked up the pen and stared at the blank page for a long moment. Finally, he began to write. His handwriting was shaky, and his words felt inadequate, but he poured his heart into the message. "Elijah, I owe you an apology. I judged you without knowing you, and I said things I'm not proud of. After learning about who you are and what you've done, I realize how wrong I was. You're an incredible person, and the world is better because of you. Thank you for your service, your bravery, and your kindness. I'm sorry for not seeing it sooner." James put the pen down, his chest heavy with emotion. He didn't know if Elijah would ever read the message, but writing it felt like a small step toward making things right. As the event continued, James kept to himself, observing the people around him. He noticed a young woman sitting near the front of the room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked familiar, and it took him a moment to realize why. She bore a striking resemblance to Elijah. Her eyes had the same depth, the same quiet strength. Curious, James moved closer, taking a seat a few rows behind her. He listened as she spoke softly with an older man, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I just hope he knows how much we love him," she said. "He's always been so strong, but this time, it's different. I don't know what I'd do if—" Her voice trailed off, and the older man placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. James felt a pang of guilt all over again. This wasn't just a story in the news. This was real life. Elijah wasn't just a hero to strangers. He was a son, a brother, a friend. He was loved deeply by the people in this room, and James had been too blind to see it. As the event began to wind down, James found himself standing near the exit, unsure of what to do next. He had come here hoping to find some sense of closure, but instead, he felt more conflicted than ever. He wanted to do more, to be better, but he didn't know where to start. Just as he was about to leave, the young woman he had noticed earlier walked past him, her expression weary but determined. Their eyes met briefly, and James felt the urge to say something, to acknowledge her connection to Elijah. But the words caught in his throat, and she was gone before he could find his voice. James stepped outside into the cool evening air, his thoughts racing. The tension in his chest hadn't eased, and he knew it wouldn't until he found a way to truly make amends. For now, all he could do was take things one step at a time and hope that somehow his efforts would make a difference.